Portland, Oregon, October 2013. A city known for its vibrant art scene, coffee culture, and the misty rain that seems to define the Pacific Northwest. In the Hawthorne district, a quiet residential neighborhood filled with modest homes and tree-lined streets, life moved at a predictable pace. Neighbors knew each other by name, children played on sidewalks until dusk, and the most exciting event of the week was usually someone's garage sale on Saturday morning. Ethan Rivera had lived in this neighborhood for almost 2 years. 23 years old, a film student at Portland State University, Ethan was the kind of young man who saw the world through a lens. Everything was a potential frame, a possible story waiting to be captured. His small apartment on the second floor of an older building gave him just enough space for his equipment, his dreams, and his obsession with learning every technical aspect of cinematography. October had arrived with its characteristic chill, the kind that sneaks through closed windows and reminds residents that winter is approaching. Ethan had just purchased a new camera, a semi-professional model with advanced night vision capabilities. For a film student working on a documentary project about urban landscapes after dark, this camera was everything. He had saved for months, working part-time at a local bookstore, skipping social events, all to afford this piece of equipment that would elevate his student work to something more professional. The night of October 15th started like any other. Ethan returned home around 10 in the evening after a study session at the university library. He made himself instant ramen, scrolled through social media for a bit, and then decided it was time to test his new camera. The instruction manual sat on his desk, pages marked with sticky notes, where he had highlighted features he wanted to try. Night vision mode was at the top of his list. Around 11:30, Ethan set up the camera by his bedroom window, which faced the back of the neighboring properties. His plan was simple: let the camera record for a few hours, capture the stillness of the neighborhood at night, study the quality of the footage, and understand how the night vision performed in real conditions. He adjusted the angle, made sure the battery was fully charged, pressed record, and went to bed. What Ethan did not know was that his camera, positioned at that specific angle, had a clear view of the backyard belonging to Marcus Brennan. Marcus lived in the house directly behind Ethan's building, a single-story home with white siding that had seen better days. Marcus was 41 years old, worked as an auto mechanic at a shop across town, and kept mostly to himself. In the 2 years Ethan had lived there, they had exchanged perhaps a dozen words, mostly polite greetings when their paths crossed at the neighborhood grocery store. The camera recorded through the night, hours of darkness, the occasional car passing on distant streets, the movement of trees swaying in the wind. But at exactly 2:17 in the morning, something changed. The motion sensor built into the camera registered significant movement in Marcus Brennan's backyard. The night vision activated fully, bathing the scene in that distinctive greenish-gray glow that makes everything look like it belongs in a surveillance operation. Marcus appeared in frame, emerging from his back door. He was dressed in dark clothing, a heavy jacket despite the mild temperature. But what caught the camera's attention, what would later send investigators down a path no one could have predicted, were the 2 large suitcases he was dragging behind him. The way he moved suggested the suitcases were heavy, very heavy. His body leaned forward with effort, his steps deliberate and strained. The camera captured everything with clinical precision. Marcus dragged the suitcases across his lawn to the far corner of his property, an area partially obscured by an old oak tree. He disappeared from frame for a moment, then returned carrying a shovel. For the next hour and 40 minutes, Marcus Brennan dug. The camera recorded every moment, the rhythmic motion of digging, the growing pile of dirt beside the hole, the occasional pause where Marcus would straighten his back and look around, as if checking to make sure no one was watching. At 4:03 in the morning, Marcus lifted the first suitcase and lowered it into the hole, then the second. He stood there for a moment, looking down at whatever he had just buried before beginning to fill the hole back in. By 5:15, the job was complete. The dirt had been replaced, roughly leveled. Marcus gathered his shovel, took one last look at the spot, and walked back into his house. The camera continued recording until its battery died around 6:30 in the morning, capturing the first light of dawn creeping over the scene of whatever had just transpired. Ethan woke up around 9, groggy and running late for his morning class. He grabbed his backpack, glanced at the camera still sitting by the window, and made a mental note to review the footage later. The day passed normally. Classes, lunch with friends, a few hours working on an essay due the following week. It was not until that evening, around 7, that Ethan finally sat down at his laptop to review what his new camera had captured. He transferred the files, opened the video, and began scrubbing through the footage at high speed. Hours of nothing, exactly what he expected. But then his cursor hit the 2:17 mark, and movement filled the screen. Ethan slowed the playback to normal speed. His eyes widened as he watched Marcus Brennan drag those suitcases across the yard. He leaned closer to the screen as he watched the digging begin. Ethan's first reaction was confusion. Why would someone bury suitcases in the middle of the night? His second reaction was concern. The entire scene felt wrong. The time of night, the secretive nature of the actions, the physical effort Marcus put into digging that hole. Ethan watched the footage 3 times, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He considered his options. Go to the police? And tell them what exactly? That his neighbor was burying suitcases? Was that even illegal? Maybe Marcus was hiding valuables, maybe he had his reasons. Ethan had heard stories about people who did not trust banks, who buried their savings in their yards. But at 2 in the morning? And why did Marcus keep looking around as if terrified of being seen? Ethan saved the footage to his laptop and created a backup on an external drive. He did not know what to do with this information, but something told him it might be important. For the next day and a half, October 16th and most of the 17th, Ethan went about his normal routine, but the footage stayed in his mind. He found himself watching Marcus's house from his window, looking for anything unusual. Marcus came and went on schedule, left for work in the morning, returned in the evening. Everything appeared normal. On the afternoon of October 17th, Ethan made a decision. He would show the footage to Devin Walsh, his closest friend since freshman year. Devin was studying criminal justice, planning to become a lawyer. If anyone could give him solid advice about what to do, it would be Devin. Ethan sent a text message. Need to show you something important. Can you come over tonight? Devin responded within minutes. Sure. Around 8? Ethan confirmed. He spent the rest of the afternoon trying to focus on homework, but his mind kept returning to that footage, to Marcus Brennan standing over that hole in the ground, to those heavy suitcases disappearing into the earth. 8 o'clock came and went. Devin did not show up. Ethan sent another text. You coming? No response. Ethan called. The phone rang and went to voicemail. This was unusual. Devin was reliable, always on time, always responded to messages. By 9:30, Ethan decided to go find Devin himself. He grabbed his keys, his phone, and headed for the door. His laptop sat open on his desk. The video file paused on a frame showing Marcus Brennan, shovel in hand, standing beside that freshly dug hole. Ethan never made it to Devin's apartment. What happened in the next few hours would transform a curious piece of footage into evidence in a criminal investigation that would shake the quiet neighborhood of Hawthorne to its core. But those details, those terrible details, were still unknown as Ethan stepped out of his apartment and into the October night. What no one knew yet was that time had already run out. Devin Walsh did arrive at Ethan's apartment that night, just not at 8 o'clock as planned. He showed up closer to 8:45, delayed by an unexpected meeting with his academic advisor that ran long. Devin climbed the stairs to the second floor, knocked on Ethan's door and waited. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time, and called out Ethan's name. Still nothing. Devin tried the door handle. Locked. He pulled out his phone and called Ethan. From inside the apartment, he could hear the muffled sound of a ringtone, but no one picked up. This struck Devin as odd. Ethan had been insistent about meeting tonight, had said it was important, urgent even. Why would he leave? Devin sent a text. I'm at your door. Where are you? He waited 15 minutes in the hallway, checking his phone repeatedly, but received no response. Finally, he left, assuming Ethan had been called away for some emergency and would explain later. Devin went home, finished some reading for class, and went to bed thinking nothing more of it. The next morning, October 18th, Devin had an early class that he shared with Ethan. Film theory. 9 in the morning. A class neither of them ever missed because the professor was known for pop quizzes. Devin arrived 5 minutes early, scanned the room, and noticed Ethan's usual seat was empty. The class started. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Ethan never showed. After class, Devin tried calling again, straight to voicemail. He sent several text messages throughout the day, each one going unanswered. By early afternoon, Devin's mild concern had evolved into something stronger. This was not like Ethan. Even if something had come up, Ethan always responded to messages, always kept people informed of his plans. Around 4 in the afternoon, Devin decided to go back to Ethan's apartment. He made the 20-minute walk from campus, rehearsing in his mind what he would say if Ethan answered the door annoyed at being checked on. But when Devin reached the building and climbed those stairs again, he found something that made his stomach tighten with worry. The door to Ethan's apartment was ajar, open just a few inches. The frame slightly splintered near the lock as if forced. Devin pushed it open slowly, calling Ethan's name. No response. He stepped inside. The apartment was small, essentially one large room that served as bedroom, living room, and workspace, with a tiny kitchen in the corner and a bathroom off to the side. Devin had been here dozens of times and knew how Ethan kept his space. Organized chaos, Ethan called it. Film equipment neatly arranged on shelves, but papers and textbooks scattered across every surface. What Devin saw now was different. Signs of disruption. A chair knocked over near the desk. Books scattered on the floor that Ethan would never have left that way. The bedsheets pulled partially off the mattress. And most telling, Ethan's backpack was still there, sitting beside the desk. Ethan never went anywhere without that backpack. It contained his wallet, his student ID, everything he needed for daily life. Devin moved carefully through the apartment, his criminal justice training kicking in even as his hands started to shake. He checked the bathroom. Empty. He looked in the small closet. Ethan's jacket was missing and his shoes, but everything else seemed untouched. He returned to the main room, and that is when he noticed the laptop. It sat open on the desk, the screen dark, but the power light still glowing. Devin tapped the trackpad and the screen came to life. No password protection, typical of Ethan, who found such security measures annoying when he needed to access his files quickly. The screen displayed a video player, paused on a frame of what appeared to be night vision footage. Devin could make out a figure in the frame, someone standing in what looked like a backyard holding a shovel. Devin's finger hovered over the play button. He knew he should not touch anything, should call the police immediately, but he needed to understand what was happening. He pressed play. For the next several minutes, Devin watched in growing horror as the footage revealed Marcus Brennan, dragging suitcases, digging a hole, burying whatever was in those cases. The timestamp showed October 15th, just 3 days ago. Devin's mind raced through the implications. Ethan had recorded this, had discovered something, had wanted to show him this footage, and now Ethan was missing, and his apartment showed signs of a struggle. Devin grabbed his phone with trembling hands and dialed 911. The dispatcher answered on the second ring. Devin tried to keep his voice steady as he explained the situation. A missing person, signs of forced entry, possible evidence of a crime. The dispatcher told him to leave the apartment immediately and wait outside for officers to arrive. Devin did as instructed, standing on the sidewalk in front of the building as the October afternoon turned to evening. He watched the street, checking every passing car, hoping against reason that Ethan would somehow appear, would have some innocent explanation for all of this. But Ethan did not appear. 2 patrol officers arrived within 15 minutes. Devin explained everything, showed them the apartment, pointed out the laptop and the video still displayed on the screen. The officers secured the scene and called for a detective. Within the hour, Detective Sandra Hoffman arrived. Sandra Hoffman was 46 years old, a 17-year veteran of the Portland Police Bureau, assigned to the Major Crimes Division. She had worked everything from robbery to homicide, and she carried herself with the calm efficiency of someone who had seen enough to never be surprised but still cared enough to be thorough. She listened to Devin's account, asked precise questions, and then spent 30 minutes examining the apartment while crime scene technicians photographed and documented everything. When Detective Hoffman finally sat down with Devin outside the building, her expression was serious. She wanted to know everything about Ethan, his habits, his friends, his routines. Did he have enemies? Any recent conflicts? Mental health issues? Devin answered every question, painting a picture of a normal young man, passionate about film, responsible, not someone who would just vanish. Then Detective Hoffman asked about the video. Devin described what he had seen, the night vision footage, the neighbor burying suitcases in the middle of the night. Hoffman's jaw tightened slightly, the only outward sign of her internal calculation. She asked for the neighbor's name. Devin did not know. He described the house, the one directly behind Ethan's building with the white siding. Detective Hoffman made several phone calls. Property records were pulled. The house belonged to Marcus Brennan, age 41, employed as an auto mechanic. No significant criminal record beyond a DUI from 7 years ago. Hoffman organized a patrol unit to drive by the Brennan residence, just a visual check. Nothing to alert the occupant. The report came back within an hour. Lights were on in the house. A vehicle was parked in the driveway registered to Marcus Brennan. Everything appeared normal, but Detective Hoffman knew that normal appearances often concealed terrible truths. She made another call, this one to a judge she knew kept late hours, and began the process of obtaining a search warrant. As night fell on October 18th, an official missing person case was opened for Ethan Rivera. His photograph was entered into databases. Alerts were sent to hospitals and surrounding jurisdictions. But Detective Hoffman's attention remained fixed on that video, on Marcus Brennan, and on a growing certainty that whatever had happened to Ethan was connected to what that camera had captured 3 nights ago. The investigation was now moving forward with focused urgency, but the most important question remained unanswered. Where was Ethan Rivera, and was he still alive? Detective Sandra Hoffman understood that timing was everything in a missing person investigation. The first 48 hours were critical, and in Ethan Rivera's case, those hours were already slipping away. By the morning of October 19th, Ethan had been missing for approximately 36 hours, possibly longer. Hoffman had worked through most of the night, coordinating with the district attorney's office to expedite the search warrant for Marcus Brennan's property. The warrant was approved at 6:45 in the morning. Judge Patricia Coleman reviewed the affidavit, which included Devin Walsh's statement, the description of the video footage, and the suspicious circumstances of Ethan's disappearance. The connection was enough. By 7:30, Detective Hoffman was assembling a team outside the Portland Police Bureau's Central Precinct. The team included 4 uniformed officers, 2 evidence technicians, and Detective James Park, Hoffman's partner of 3 years. They reviewed the approach strategy in the parking lot as dawn broke over Portland. The plan was straightforward. Knock and announce, serve the warrant. Conduct a thorough search of the property with special attention to the backyard area shown in Ethan's video. At 8:15, 3 police vehicles pulled up in front of Marcus Brennan's house. The white siding looked even more worn in the morning light, the paint peeling in places, the small front porch cluttered with old automotive parts and tools. Detective Hoffman approached the front door and knocked firmly, announcing their presence and purpose. Marcus Brennan answered after the 3rd knock. He appeared disheveled, wearing sweatpants and a wrinkled t-shirt, his hair uncombed. His eyes went from confused to alarmed as he saw the cluster of police officers on his porch. Detective Hoffman introduced herself, showed him the warrant, and explained they would be searching his property. Marcus read the warrant slowly, his hands visibly shaking, then stepped aside without saying a word. While 2 officers stayed with Marcus in the living room, the rest of the team spread out through the house. Detective Hoffman went directly to the backyard. The space was maybe 40 feet deep and 30 feet wide, bordered by a wooden fence that had seen better days. An old oak tree dominated the back corner, exactly as shown in Ethan's footage. Hoffman walked slowly across the yard, studying the ground. Most of the grass was brown and patchy, typical for October in Portland. But in the far corner, beneath the oak tree, there was an area roughly 6 feet by 4 feet where the ground looked disturbed. The grass was trampled, the soil slightly mounded compared to the surrounding area. Hoffman marked the spot and called for the evidence technicians. The excavation began at 9 o'clock. 2 officers with shovels started carefully removing layers of dirt, while an evidence technician photographed each stage of the process. Detective Hoffman stood nearby, watching, aware that Marcus Brennan was now seated in the back of a patrol car, having been removed from the house for the duration of the search. 18 inches down, a shovel struck something solid. The officers slowed their pace, switching to hand trowels and brushes. Within minutes, they had uncovered the edge of a suitcase, dark blue fabric caked with dirt. They cleared around it carefully, revealing the full outline. It took another 20 minutes to free it completely from the earth and lift it onto a tarp spread beside the hole. The suitcase was locked. An evidence technician used bolt cutters to break the small padlock. Detective Hoffman crouched beside it as the technician slowly unzipped the case. The smell hit immediately, not the overwhelming stench of decomposition, but something musty and chemical, like old perfume mixed with mothballs. Inside were clothes, women's clothes, blouses, jeans, dresses, all neatly folded despite being buried. Underneath the clothes were personal items, a hairbrush with strands of blonde hair still tangled in the bristles, a jewelry box containing inexpensive earrings and necklaces, a makeup bag filled with cosmetics. At the bottom of the suitcase, wrapped in a plastic bag, were documents: a birth certificate, a social security card, a passport. Detective Hoffman lifted the passport carefully and opened it. The photograph showed a woman in her mid-30s with blonde hair and a hesitant smile. The name read, Claire Marie Brennan, date of birth, March 7, 1978. The passport had been issued in 2009 and had expired 2 years ago. Hoffman's pulse quickened. She looked back at the hole where officers were now uncovering the second suitcase. This one was slightly larger, black with silver trim. The same careful process of excavation, the same use of bolt cutters on the lock. When this suitcase opened, it contained more of the same. Clothes, shoes, more personal items, photo albums showing Claire Brennan at various stages of life, graduation pictures, wedding photos that included Marcus Brennan looking younger and happier. But it was what the evidence technician found at the very bottom of the second suitcase that changed everything. A winter coat, beige with brown buttons, folded tightly. When the technician lifted it out and unfolded it carefully, everyone present could see the dark stains on the fabric. Brown, dried, concentrated around the midsection and sleeves. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone who had worked crime scenes. Blood. Detective Hoffman immediately called for additional resources. The backyard was now officially a crime scene. Yellow tape went up, more investigators arrived, and a forensic team began a systematic search of the entire property. While this activity unfolded, Hoffman returned to the patrol car where Marcus Brennan sat in the back seat, staring straight ahead, with an expression that seemed to hover between shock and resignation. Hoffman opened the door and informed Marcus that he needed to come to the police station to answer questions. Marcus nodded slowly and asked if he was under arrest. Hoffman explained that he was being detained for questioning regarding suspicious items found on his property. Marcus said nothing more during the drive to the precinct. In interview room 3, a small windowless space with gray walls and a metal table, Detective Hoffman and Detective Park sat across from Marcus Brennan. A video camera in the corner documented everything. Hoffman read Marcus his Miranda rights and asked if he understood. He said yes. She asked if he wanted an attorney present. Marcus hesitated, then shook his head. The interview began with background questions. How long had Marcus lived at that address? 8 years. Was he married? Yes, but his wife had left him. When did she leave? Back in August 20th to be exact. Why did she leave? They had been having problems, arguments about money and other things, and one day she just packed up and left. Detective Hoffman let Marcus tell this story without interruption, watching his body language, noting how his eyes moved constantly, never settling on one place for more than a second. Then she asked the critical question, if your wife left in August, why are her belongings buried in your backyard? Marcus's face changed. The color drained from his cheeks. He opened his mouth, but no words came out at first. Finally, he managed to say that he did not know what she was talking about. Hoffman described the suitcases, described the contents, and mentioned the coat with the bloodstains. Marcus slumped in his chair. He asked for water. Detective Park left the room and returned with a plastic cup. Marcus drank it in one long gulp, then set the cup down with a trembling hand. He looked at Detective Hoffman and said he wanted to tell the truth, but he was scared. Hoffman assured him that cooperation would be noted, that honesty was his best option now. Marcus took a deep breath and began to speak. But instead of a confession, what came out was the same story, now more detailed but still maintaining that Claire had left him. He admitted burying her belongings because he was angry, because seeing her things every day was painful, because he wanted to forget. He insisted he had no idea about any blood on the coat, suggested maybe Claire had injured herself and never mentioned it. The interview continued for 2 hours. Marcus's story never fundamentally changed, despite Hoffman's methodical questioning from different angles. Finally, she informed Marcus that he was being placed under arrest on suspicion of homicide. The physical evidence, the suspicious burial, his contradictory statements, all pointed to probable cause. Marcus was processed, photographed, fingerprinted, and placed in a holding cell. Meanwhile, the forensic analysis was beginning. The blood on the coat would be tested, compared against DNA samples that investigators would obtain from Claire Brennan's family. The entire contents of both suitcases would be cataloged and examined. Marcus's house would be searched from top to bottom for any trace evidence. But even as this machinery of investigation moved forward, Detective Hoffman's thoughts remained on Ethan Rivera, a young man who had accidentally recorded something significant, who had disappeared shortly after, whose apartment showed signs of forced entry. The connection seemed obvious, but proving it would require more than intuition. What they needed now was evidence, concrete and irrefutable, that would link Marcus Brennan not just to whatever had happened to his wife, but to the disappearance of the film student who had witnessed something he was never meant to see. The investigation split into two parallel tracks. One focused on Claire Brennan, the woman whose belongings had been buried like secrets in the October earth. The other centered on Ethan Rivera, whose absence grew more ominous with each passing hour. Detective Hoffman coordinated both efforts from the Major Crimes Division, working 20-hour days fueled by coffee and the stubborn refusal to let either case go cold. Claire Brennan's family was located within hours. Her sister, Laura Brennan, lived in Eugene, about 2 hours south of Portland. When detectives contacted her by phone on the afternoon of October 19th, Laura's response was immediate and emotional. She had been trying to find Claire for months. Marcus had told the family that Claire left him, had moved away to start over somewhere else. Laura never believed it. Claire would never cut off contact with her family, would never disappear without a word. Laura drove to Portland that same evening and met with Detective Hoffman at the police station. She was 39 years old, a high school teacher, and she carried with her a folder stuffed with documents, phone records showing her repeated attempts to reach Claire's cell phone, which had been disconnected in late August, emails sent to Claire's address that bounced back, even a missing person report that Laura had filed with Eugene police in September, though that investigation had gone nowhere because Claire was an adult and there was no evidence of foul play. Laura provided DNA samples, hair from Claire's brush that she had kept, anything that might help identify the blood found on that coat. She also provided photographs, recent ones that showed Claire as she looked in the months before she vanished. A woman with shoulder-length blonde hair, tired eyes, and a smile that seemed forced in every picture. Laura talked about her sister's marriage, how it had deteriorated over the years, how Marcus had become increasingly controlling and jealous. There had been incidents, Laura revealed, times when Claire showed up to family gatherings with bruises she explained away as accidents. A Thanksgiving dinner 3 years ago where Marcus exploded in anger over something trivial, and they left early. Claire had confided in Laura occasionally, admitting that Marcus scared her sometimes, but she always insisted she could handle it, that things would get better. They never did. The last time Laura spoke to Claire was August 18, 2013, a brief phone call where Claire sounded stressed. She mentioned an argument with Marcus about money, about bills they could not pay. She said she needed to go, that Marcus had just gotten home. That was the last conversation. 2 days later, according to Marcus, Claire left him, but Laura had not heard from her sister since that final phone call. While this background on Claire Brennan emerged, the forensic work continued. The blood on the coat was sent for expedited DNA analysis. The crime lab promised results within 72 hours. Meanwhile, investigators executed additional search warrants for Marcus's financial records, phone records, and employment history. What they found began to paint a troubling picture. Marcus Brennan's bank statements showed large cash withdrawals in the days following Claire's disappearance. $1,500 on August 21st, another $1,000 on August 23rd. His phone records revealed calls to several numbers that investigators traced back to hardware stores, storage facilities, and one call to a 24-hour pharmacy. Credit card receipts placed Marcus at a Home Depot on August 20th, where he purchased heavy-duty trash bags, bleach, and rubber gloves. But it was the records from October that drew Detective Hoffman's sharpest attention. On October 16th, the day after Ethan recorded that footage, Marcus made a purchase at a different hardware store. The receipt showed he bought 2 shovels, a tarp, and a roll of contractor-grade plastic sheeting. His phone records for that day showed multiple calls to Ethan Rivera's cell phone number, calls that started at 11 in the morning and continued throughout the afternoon. This information transformed the investigation's urgency. Marcus had clearly discovered that Ethan had recorded him, had likely confronted Ethan about it. The forced entry to Ethan's apartment, the signs of struggle, all suggested a violent confrontation. Detective Hoffman obtained warrants for Marcus's vehicle, a 2007 Ford pickup truck that had been impounded from his driveway. The forensic examination of the truck took place on October 20th. Technicians went through it methodically, checking every surface, every crevice. In the bed of the truck, beneath a tonneau cover, they found soil that appeared consistent with the soil from Marcus's backyard. But more significantly, in the cab of the truck between the seats they found Ethan Rivera's cell phone. The phone was turned off, the battery dead. Forensic specialists charged it carefully in a controlled environment and extracted its data. The last activity on the phone was at 9:47 p.m. on October 17th. A text message to Devin Walsh that was never sent, still sitting in the drafts folder. It read, "Devin, if you get this, the video is on my laptop. Go to the police. I think he knows." That unsent message confirmed the worst fears. Ethan had known he was in danger. He had tried to warn his friend, but he never got the chance to send it. The search for Ethan intensified. Detective Hoffman coordinated with multiple agencies across Oregon and neighboring states. Search and rescue teams were deployed to areas around Portland where someone might dispose of evidence or a body. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew grid patterns over forests and rural areas. But the Pacific Northwest is vast, covered in dense wilderness crossed by countless logging roads and abandoned properties. Investigators focused on locations that Marcus Brennan might have access to. They discovered through interviews with his co-workers that Marcus's family owned property in the Cascade Mountains, about 80 miles east of Portland. An old hunting cabin that Marcus's father had built in the 1970s, rarely used now, accessible only by a rough dirt road that became impassable in winter. On October 22nd, Detective Hoffman led a team to that location. The drive took nearly 3 hours, the last 40 minutes on roads that barely qualified as roads, just tracks through the forest that required four-wheel drive vehicles. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by Douglas firs and western red cedars. It was a simple structure, one room with a loft, weathered wood siding, a stone chimney that leaned slightly to one side. The cabin door was unlocked. Inside, everything was thick with dust and cobwebs, except for one area near the back wall where the floor showed disturbance, where something had clearly been dragged across the wood recently. Detective Hoffman examined the marks, followed them to a storage closet built into the wall. She opened the door. Empty, but the smell was there, faint but unmistakable to anyone who had worked homicide cases. The sweet, cloying odor of decomposition. Something had been in that closet, something that had been there long enough to leave its mark. The search team expanded their perimeter around the cabin. They moved through the forest systematically, checking behind trees, under fallen logs, anywhere that might conceal evidence. It was one of the younger officers, a patrol cop named Daniel Torres, who had volunteered for the search, who made the discovery. Approximately 200 yards from the cabin, down a slope where the forest grew thick and the ground became soft with moss and pine needles, Officer Torres found a disturbed area. Branches had been pulled over a spot, an attempt at concealment that might have worked if not for the dedicated search. Torres called for Detective Hoffman. The excavation began immediately. Within an hour, they uncovered what they had been dreading: a body wrapped in blue plastic tarp, buried in a shallow grave. The decomposition was significant after 5 days in the ground, but certain details were clear. Male, young, wearing clothing consistent with what Ethan Rivera had been described as wearing the last time anyone saw him. Detective Hoffman stood over the grave as the medical examiner's team took over the recovery process. She felt the weight of failure, of being too late, of not moving fast enough to save this young man who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time with a camera. But alongside that, grief was a hardening resolve. Ethan Rivera would get justice. Claire Brennan would get justice. Marcus Brennan would answer for everything. The body was transported to the medical examiner's office in Portland. Positive identification would require dental records or DNA, but Detective Hoffman had no doubt about who they had found. She returned to the city that evening, October 22nd, and went directly to the detention center where Marcus Brennan was being held. It was time for another conversation, armed now with evidence that would be much harder to explain away. The next phase of the investigation would focus on building an airtight case, on gathering every piece of evidence that would ensure Marcus Brennan spent the rest of his life behind bars. But first, Hoffman wanted to look him in the eye and watch him try to lie his way out of what they had just discovered in those mountains. The medical examiner's preliminary report arrived on Detective Hoffman's desk at 7:30 in the morning on October 23rd. She read it standing up, her coffee growing cold beside her as she absorbed the clinical language that described the end of Ethan Rivera's life. The body had been positively identified through dental records. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with being struck by a heavy object, possibly a metal tool. Time of death was estimated at somewhere between late evening October 17th and early morning October 18th. The report included additional findings: defensive wounds on Ethan's hands and forearms, suggesting he had tried to protect himself. Soil samples taken from his clothing matched soil from the burial site, but also contained traces consistent with the soil in Marcus Brennan's backyard. Fibers on his jacket matched the interior carpet of Marcus's truck. The physical evidence was building into an overwhelming narrative. But Detective Hoffman knew that physical evidence alone, while powerful, was only part of building a case that would satisfy a jury beyond reasonable doubt. She needed more. She needed to understand the sequence of events, needed to place Marcus at every crucial location, needed to eliminate any possibility of reasonable doubt that a defense attorney might exploit. The investigation team gathered that morning in the conference room at Major Crimes. 12 people around a long table covered with file folders, photographs, maps, and timeline charts. Detective Park began by reviewing what they knew with certainty. Marcus Brennan had buried his wife's belongings, possibly after killing her in late August. Ethan Rivera had accidentally recorded Marcus burying those items on October 15th. Marcus had somehow discovered this, had confronted Ethan on October 17th, and had killed him to prevent that evidence from reaching authorities. But there were gaps in this narrative that needed filling. How did Marcus discover that Ethan had recorded him? How did he get Ethan to go with him willingly, or had he forced him? What exactly happened during those final hours of Ethan's life? The answer to the first question came from Marcus's phone records, specifically his data usage. On October 16th, Marcus's phone showed extensive internet activity, multiple searches for home security systems, outdoor cameras, and then, tellingly, searches for the address range of his own neighborhood. Investigators theorized that Marcus had become paranoid after burying the suitcases, had perhaps noticed something, or simply been anxious enough to start researching whether neighbors might have security cameras pointed toward his property. A canvass of the neighborhood conducted over the past few days had revealed that 3 houses on Ethan Street had security cameras, though none had angles that captured Marcus's backyard. But that canvas had likely led Marcus to start asking questions, to start knocking on doors himself. Neighbors reported that on October 16th and 17th, Marcus had come by several houses asking about security systems, claiming he was thinking of installing one and wanted recommendations. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Margaret Chen who lived in the building next to Ethan's, remembered Marcus asking specifically whether anyone in her building had cameras. She had mentioned, innocently, that the young film student on the second floor always had cameras set up, was always filming something. It was this casual comment, investigators believed, that had sealed Ethan's fate. Marcus's phone records showed he began calling Ethan's number on the morning of October 17th. 16 calls throughout the day, most going to voicemail. Then, at 7:38 p.m., there was a connection that lasted 42 seconds. Long enough for a brief conversation. What was said in that conversation would remain unknown, but the outcome was clear. Ethan had agreed to meet with Marcus, or had been convinced to open his door when Marcus showed up. Cell tower data placed both phones, Marcus's and Ethan's, at Ethan's apartment around 8 p.m. Then both phones began moving, pinging off towers that traced a route eastward out of Portland toward the mountains. The last activity on Ethan's phone was that unsent text message at 9:47 p.m., by which time they were well outside the city limits. Detective Hoffman authorized subpoenas for traffic cameras and private security systems along the route indicated by the cell tower data. It was tedious work, reviewing hours of footage, but it paid off. A gas station camera on Highway 26 captured Marcus's truck passing by at 9:23 p.m. on October 17th. The image quality was poor but sufficient to show 2 figures in the cab of the truck. The timeline was becoming clearer, but there were still pieces missing. Specifically, where was Claire Brennan's body? The suitcases contained her belongings, her blood was on that coat, but without a body, a defense attorney could argue that Claire was still alive somewhere, that the blood came from an injury, that Marcus had buried her belongings for the innocent reasons he claimed. Detective Hoffman made the decision to bring Marcus Brennan in for another interview. He had been formally charged with the murder of Ethan Rivera based on the physical evidence and the cell phone data. His attorney, a public defender named Robert Ashford, was present this time. The interview took place in the same room as before, but the dynamic was different. Marcus no longer appeared shocked or confused. He looked exhausted, defeated, like someone who had been carrying an impossible weight and was finally ready to set it down. Detective Hoffman did not start with accusations or threats. She simply laid out the evidence piece by piece, like cards on a table. The cell tower data, the traffic camera footage, the forensic evidence from the truck, the body found near the cabin. She spoke calmly, methodically, giving Marcus time to absorb each detail. His attorney sat beside him taking notes but said nothing. When Hoffman finished, she asked Marcus if he wanted to tell his side of the story. Robert Ashford advised his client not to answer, but Marcus held up a hand, silencing his lawyer. He looked at Detective Hoffman and said he was tired of lying, tired of pretending, tired of living with what he had done. What followed was a confession that lasted nearly 3 hours, recorded on video, with his attorney present throughout. Marcus described the deterioration of his marriage to Claire, the fights about money, about his drinking, about his jealousy. He admitted that Claire had wanted to leave him for months, that she had been planning to file for divorce. On August 20th, 2013, they had argued again. Claire said she was leaving, was going to stay with her sister. Marcus had pleaded with her to stay, but when pleading failed, his anger took over. He did not describe the violence in detail, but he admitted that he had hit Claire, that the argument had escalated, that she had fallen and struck her head on the corner of the kitchen counter. He insisted it was not premeditated, that he had not meant to kill her, but when he checked for a pulse, there was none. Panic had set in. Marcus spent the next 2 days trying to figure out what to do. He wrapped Claire's body in plastic and stored it in the garage while he cleaned the house. While he invented the story that she had left him, he withdrew cash to make it seem like Claire had taken money and run. He sent text messages from her phone to her family saying she needed time alone. Then, when enough time had passed, he drove her body to the cabin in the mountains and buried her in the woods near there, in a location he described to detectives in precise detail. As for Ethan Rivera, Marcus admitted that discovering someone had recorded him had sent him into another panic. He had been so careful with Claire, had thought he had gotten away with it, but then this neighbor, this kid with a camera, had seen him burying the evidence. Marcus called Ethan repeatedly until Ethan finally answered. Marcus told him there had been a misunderstanding, that the suitcases contained items from his divorce, that it was embarrassing but legal. He asked Ethan to come talk, to let him explain in person. Ethan had reluctantly agreed. When Ethan arrived at Marcus's house that evening, Marcus tried to convince him to delete the footage. Ethan refused, said he needed to think about it, started to leave. Marcus could not let him leave. He grabbed a tire iron from his garage and struck Ethan from behind. Ethan fell but was still conscious, still fighting. Marcus hit him again and again, until Ethan stopped moving. Marcus loaded Ethan's body into his truck, drove to the cabin using back roads to avoid traffic, and buried him in the forest. He wiped down Ethan's phone and tossed it in his truck, intending to dispose of it later but forgetting about it in his panic. He returned to Portland, tried to clean his truck, tried to act normal, but he knew it was only a matter of time before someone came looking for Ethan. When the confession ended, the room was silent, except for the hum of the ventilation system. Detective Hoffman asked Marcus if he would show them where he buried Claire. Marcus nodded. He said he wanted both families to have closure, to be able to bury their loved ones properly. It was the first thing he had said that suggested any genuine remorse. 2 days later, on October 25th, Marcus led a team of investigators back into the Cascade Mountains, to a different area than where Ethan had been found. They hiked nearly a mile from the nearest logging road to a spot Marcus indicated beneath a fallen Douglas fir. The excavation revealed human remains, badly decomposed after 2 months in the ground, but dental records would later confirm the identity as Claire Marie Brennan. With both bodies recovered and Marcus's full confession recorded, the prosecution began building their case. The physical evidence, the timeline, the confession, all pointed to 2 deliberate acts of violence. The district attorney announced on October 28th that Marcus Brennan would be charged with 2 counts of murder in the first degree, along with additional charges of tampering with evidence and abuse of a corpse. The path to justice had been cleared, but the journey through the legal system was only beginning. Marcus's attorney would attempt to argue that Claire's death had been unintentional, manslaughter rather than murder, though the cover-up suggested otherwise. There would be motions, hearings, and ultimately a trial where a jury would decide Marcus Brennan's fate. For Detective Hoffman, the investigative work was essentially complete. She had solved the case, recovered the victims, obtained a confession. But solving a case never erased the fundamental tragedy at its core, never brought back the dead, never undid the suffering of the families left behind. As she filed her reports and prepared for the trial ahead, she thought about Ethan Rivera, a young man whose only crime was being curious and owning a camera with night vision, and she thought about Claire Brennan, a woman who had tried to escape a bad marriage and paid for it with her life. The system would now determine what justice looked like for Marcus Brennan, but for his victims, justice would always be incomplete. The machinery of the criminal justice system moved forward with deliberate precision. Marcus Brennan's arraignment took place on November 4, 2013, in the Multnomah County Circuit Court. He appeared in an orange jail jumpsuit, shackled at the wrists and ankles, flanked by his attorney Robert Ashford and 2 corrections officers. Judge William Hartley presided, reading the charges in a steady voice that echoed through the courtroom. 2 counts of murder in the first degree, 2 counts of abuse of a corpse, tampering with physical evidence, and unlawful disposal of human remains. Marcus entered a plea of not guilty, a legal formality that surprised no one despite his earlier confession. His attorney had advised him that the confession, while damaging, could potentially be challenged on various grounds, and that pleading not guilty preserved all options for defense. Bail was denied given the severity of the charges and the fact that Marcus was considered a flight risk. He was remanded to the Multnomah County Detention Center to await trial. The months that followed were consumed by pretrial proceedings. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Catherine Morrison, assembled their case with meticulous care. Every piece of physical evidence was cataloged and prepared for presentation. Expert witnesses were lined up, the medical examiner who would testify about the causes of death, forensic specialists who would explain the DNA and fiber evidence, cell phone analysts who would walk the jury through the location data that placed Marcus at every crucial scene. The defense team, now expanded to include a second attorney specializing in homicide cases, pursued several strategies simultaneously. They filed motions to suppress the confession, arguing it had been obtained under psychological duress. Judge Hartley denied this motion after reviewing the interview recordings and finding that Marcus had been properly advised of his rights and had spoken voluntarily despite his attorney's presence and advice. They attempted to challenge the search warrants that had led to the discovery of the suitcases, but again the judge found that probable cause had been properly established. As these legal maneuvers played out, the human dimension of the case continued to unfold. Laura Brennan became a vocal advocate for her sister, giving interviews to local media, pushing for the strongest possible charges against Marcus. She established a small memorial fund in Claire's name to support victims of domestic violence, channeling her grief into action that might help others avoid her sister's fate. Devin Walsh struggled with guilt and trauma. He had been Ethan's closest friend, and he could not stop thinking about the what-ifs. What if he had arrived on time that night? What if he had insisted on waiting longer at Ethan's door? What if he had immediately recognized the danger and called police sooner? Detective Hoffman met with Devin several times, assuring him that nothing he could have done would have changed the outcome, that Marcus had made his choices, and Marcus alone bore responsibility. Devin eventually sought counseling and slowly began to process the loss. Ethan's parents, Robert and Maria Rivera, flew in from their home in Arizona and stayed in Portland for weeks, working with investigators, making arrangements to transport their son's body home for burial. The funeral took place in Phoenix in early November, attended by hundreds of people, including several of Ethan's classmates who made the trip from Portland. Devin gave a eulogy, talking about Ethan's passion for film, his creativity, his kindness. He did not mention how Ethan died, only that he had been taken too soon and would be deeply missed. Claire Brennan's funeral was smaller, held in Eugene on November 16th. Her family had debated whether to hold a service at all, given the circumstances and the fact that Marcus's trial was pending. But Laura insisted that Claire deserved to be remembered and mourned properly, that she was more than just a victim in a criminal case. The service focused on Claire's life before Marcus, on her childhood, her love of painting, her years working as a veterinary technician caring for animals. Only at the end did the pastor acknowledge the tragedy of her death, asking those gathered to remember Claire with love rather than dwelling on the darkness that had claimed her. The trial was scheduled for April 2014. As the date approached, both sides intensified their preparations. The prosecution felt confident in their case. They had physical evidence, they had a timeline, they had a confession, but they also knew that murder trials were unpredictable, that juries sometimes surprised everyone, that a single sympathetic juror could result in a hung jury or even acquittal on some charges. The defense strategy became clearer in the weeks before trial. They would not dispute that Marcus had killed both Claire and Ethan, as the evidence made denial impossible. Instead, they would argue degrees of culpability. For Claire's death, They would present a narrative of an accidental killing during a domestic dispute, manslaughter rather than murder, a moment of anger that spiraled out of control. For Ethan's death, they would argue that Marcus had panicked, that fear of losing his freedom had driven him to violence he would never have otherwise committed, and they would ask the jury to consider that this was not a calculated killing, but rather the desperate act of a man already drowning in guilt and terror. The trial began on April 7, 2014. Jury selection took 3 days, with both sides carefully vetting potential jurors for any biases about domestic violence, about confession evidence, about the death penalty. Oregon had abolished the death penalty in 1964 and reinstated it in 1984, but it was rarely sought, and this case did not qualify under the state's aggravating factors criteria. Still, Marcus faced the possibility of 2 consecutive life sentences without parole, effectively ensuring he would die in prison. The prosecution's case unfolded over 2 weeks. Catherine Morrison walked the jury through the evidence chronologically, building a narrative that was both comprehensive and devastating. She started with Claire's disappearance, showing photographs of the vibrant woman she had been, then introducing the evidence of her death, the buried suitcases, the blood-stained coat, the DNA matches. She presented testimony from Laura Brennan about Claire's fears regarding Marcus, about the history of controlling behavior and violence. Then Morrison shifted to Ethan Rivera. She showed the jury the video footage that Ethan had recorded, the grainy night vision images of Marcus burying those suitcases. She called Devin Walsh to testify about finding Ethan's apartment disturbed, about the laptop still displaying that crucial video. The cell phone data was presented through charts and maps that traced the final journey from Portland to the mountains. The medical examiner testified about Ethan's injuries, describing the blunt force trauma that had ended his life. The confession was played for the jury in its entirety. 3 hours of Marcus Brennan describing both killings in his own words. The courtroom was silent except for Marcus's recorded voice, and occasional muffled sobs from the victims' families seated in the gallery. The defense presented their case in just 4 days. They called character witnesses who testified that Marcus had been a good employee, a reliable co-worker, someone who had struggled with personal problems but had never shown violent tendencies at work. They presented a psychologist who testified about the psychological state of someone covering up an accidental killing, the fear and paranoia that could drive normally nonviolent people to extreme actions. Robert Ashford's closing argument focused on the concept of reasonable doubt and degrees of guilt. He acknowledged that Marcus had killed both victims, but asked the jury to consider the circumstances, to see Claire's death as a tragic accident escalated by anger rather than premeditated murder, and to see Ethan's death as a panicked response rather than calculated killing. He asked for mercy in the form of lesser verdicts that would still hold Marcus accountable, but recognized the difference between someone who plans to kill and someone who kills in the moment. Catherine Morrison's closing argument was forceful and emotional. She reminded the jury that Marcus had 2 months to come forward about Claire's death, 2 months during which he instead constructed an elaborate lie and buried her body in an isolated forest. She pointed out that Marcus had lured Ethan to his house under false pretenses, had armed himself with a tire iron, had struck him multiple times, and had then buried him just as he had buried Claire. These were not accidents, Morrison argued. These were choices, deliberate decisions to end lives and hide the evidence. The jury began deliberations on April 24th. They deliberated for 3 full days, a length of time that made both sides nervous. Long deliberations could mean confusion, disagreement, or careful consideration. On April 27th, the jury sent word that they had reached verdicts. The courtroom was packed when the jury filed back in. Marcus stood beside his attorneys, his face pale but composed. Judge Hartley asked the foreperson if they had reached unanimous verdicts. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman who had taken careful notes throughout the trial, said they had. Guilty on both counts of murder in the first degree, guilty on all lesser charges. The verdicts were read one by one, each time the foreperson repeating the word guilty in a clear voice. Marcus showed no reaction, simply staring straight ahead. Behind him, Laura Brennan wept quietly while Ethan's parents held each other. Sentencing was scheduled for May 15th. Under Oregon law, murder in the first degree carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison with a minimum of 25 years before parole eligibility. But the judge had discretion regarding whether sentences would run concurrently or consecutively. At the sentencing hearing, both families were given the opportunity to address the court. Laura Brennan spoke about her sister, about the life Claire should have had, about the grandchildren she would never have, the art she would never create. She looked directly at Marcus and told him that he had not only killed Claire, but had also stolen her from everyone who loved her, and that she hoped he would spend the rest of his life thinking about what he had destroyed. Maria Rivera spoke for Ethan's family. Her voice shook with emotion as she described her son's dreams, his talent, his kindness. She talked about the future that had been taken from him, the films he would never make, the family he would never have. She told the court that Ethan had died simply because he had witnessed something, that his only crime was being observant and owning a camera. Marcus was given the opportunity to speak. His attorney advised against it, but Marcus insisted. He stood and faced the families, and in a halting voice said that he was sorry, that he knew those words were inadequate, but they were all he had to offer. He said he thought about both Claire and Ethan every day, that he would carry the weight of what he had done for the rest of his life. He said he deserved whatever punishment the court imposed. Judge Hartley announced his sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole for Claire's murder. A second life sentence for Ethan's murder, to run consecutively to the first. Marcus Brennan, age 42, would spend the remainder of his life in the Oregon State Penitentiary. He would never be eligible for release. Marcus was led from the courtroom in shackles. The families remained seated as the courtroom slowly emptied, processing what this conclusion meant. Justice, in the legal sense, had been served. Marcus would be punished for his crimes. But both families knew that no sentence could undo what had been done, could bring back the people they had lost. In the weeks that followed, life slowly resumed its rhythms. Detective Hoffman moved on to new cases, though she never forgot Ethan Rivera or Claire Brennan. Devin Walsh graduated from Portland State University and eventually went to law school, driven in part by his experience with this case. Laura Brennan continued her advocacy work for domestic violence victims, turning her grief into purpose. The case itself became a cautionary tale, studied in criminal justice classes, discussed in forums about domestic violence and witness protection. Ethan Rivera's video footage was preserved as evidence but also became a teaching tool about the importance of coming forward immediately when witnessing suspicious activity, about the dangers of trying to handle such situations alone. Marcus Brennan adjusted to life in prison, a small cell in a maximum security facility where he would remain until his death. He gave no interviews, filed no appeals, simply accepted his fate with the resignation of someone who had finally stopped running from the consequences of his actions. The neighborhood in Portland where all of this began slowly returned to normal. New tenants moved into Ethan's old apartment. Marcus's house was eventually sold at auction, purchased by a young couple unaware of its history. The oak tree in the backyard still stands, though the ground beneath it has long since healed over the disturbance from that October night. What remained was memory, and the understanding that 2 lives had been lost, not to fate or accident, but to choices made by one man who had valued his own freedom over the lives of others. The justice system had rendered its judgment, but the real verdict would be written in how those left behind chose to remember the victims and honor their abbreviated lives.